Right then guys, so the day's come, all the saving up has happened, we've got all the parts we need, we've done all the research I can possibly think about doing. I think I'm prepared. Let's build a stroker. Before we do, I'm just going to let you know that the car itself as it stands is on 140,000 miles, if you can make that out, just gone over last night. And let's have a little peek at the old lump, the perfectly good lump that I'm about to take apart and rebuild. Before we do that, as I'm on my way around the car, I'll just say, don't forget your oil and your oil filters, man. I nearly forgot to buy oil and oil filters at the last minute. You know, it's one of these things where you overthink everything and you get all the little trinkets, all the, you know, the wired oil pump nut and all the rest of it, and you forget the fundamentals, man. So, yeah, we've got oil now. There she is. There's the old M52 B28. She's going to come out in the next 12 hours, hopefully, get stripped down, and we're going to build a stroker. So if you've been watching my YouTube channels already, you'll know exactly what I'm up to. If you've not, then I'm about to put a longer crankshaft in this engine with different camshafts. I'm going to be basically setting the engine up to run pretty much like a US spec M3 with a 3 litre displacement and longer duration and higher lift camshafts. I've never done this before. I've done plenty of reading. I've taken a cylinder head off and put one back on a Honda before, but I've never gone deep into a block and done the whole kit and caboodle. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to show you as much as I possibly can. I don't want to really lose anything, be it good stuff or be it bad stuff. Let's see what happens. Let's hope the cylinder head bolts don't pull the threads. That's the biggest thing I'm worried about. I'm going to go real gentle on that. I've got lots and lots of things I'm going to be doing to try and stop that from happening. Let's pray to the gods of BMW that doesn't go down. If it does, we'll deal with it, but hey ho. So yeah, let's get on with it. I'm going to start getting the car up and jacked up and get all the exhaust off and the gearbox undone and all the rest of that sort of rubbish, and then we'll get the engine into the garage on the engine stand and we'll start tearing it down. Alright, just whilst I'm getting the engine and gearbox out of this thing for the stroker, I wanted to show you why I'm changing the short shifter. This is one of the adjustable short shifters that I bought from eBay with the solid bush in the bottom, 3 Allen keys to hold the actual cup in, adjustable length rod. It's not very good. I've kept it the same adjustment ever since it's been in, so what's the point in having adjustment? And just so you can see, look at the play that you've got in the actual ball joint here. That's a year old, or a year and a half old. So this is going in the bin, man. See you later. On the contrary, this is the polyurethane bush that I made about a year and a half ago, and he is perfect. There's no cracks. It's still nice and tight on the shaft. The shaft is, you know, polished up from being with it, but really chuffed with that. That worked absolutely perfectly. I've just got the engine out. I'm just pulling the gearbox off it now. As you can see, without a load leveler, it's easy to make a cock up. I've got this all at the wrong angle. I'd much rather it was being hooked on the crane about halfway down the chain. I fucked it up, but it's okay, we can work around it at the moment. I'm going to pull the box off and then I'm going to hopefully get it onto the engine stand, get it in the garage and get it stripped. It's now 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm about an hour and a half behind where I'd want to be at this point, but I'm not doing too bad, I'm pretty happy. Right, we've got the engine out and immediately we've noticed that we've got a small problem, which I did have a suspicion about. So if you don't know what you're looking at there, that is an engine mount which is hooked. It should look like this on the top. So it's completely separated, and what you can see inside is the oil inside. So this entire bolt piece is somewhere on the floor, I guess. I don't know where it is. So yeah, it's a good thing I bought new engine mounts. Okay guys, so we're going to use voiceover here for a bit of clarity. At this point we've got the engine on the engine stand. It's about 4 PM in the afternoon and it was a bit of hard work getting on the engine stand because the bolts and everything which line it up don't actually work from the gearbox. So we got there in the end, we got it on the stand and we can start working on tearing it down. Having a little look here, I'm thinking probably the easiest thing to start with is the exhaust manifolds. They're going to be the hardest bolts to remove. Let's get them out of the way first. So a generous lubrication of WD-40 on these bolts, and we're going to do, whilst we're here, the engine mount and the aircon compressor pump as well at the same time. So we get straight in and we get the 11mm socket on these engine studs. Now it'd be nice if the nuts just came off the studs, but that doesn't tend to happen. The studs, the ends of them rust, so it pulls the stud out the head with the nut. I'm mentioning this because the head that I've got that I'm using is from my 323 and I need some of these studs, so I had to go around and fix that a little bit later on in the process. So off comes the mount and off comes the back engine manifold, exhaust manifold. And immediately the first thing we notice as soon as I get the exhaust manifold off of the head is looking down into the exhaust ports. As you'll see in a few seconds here, we've got some very, very white looking exhaust valves. Now that I learned later on is a symptom of lean running. That's the carbon burning on the back of the exhaust valves. At the moment we're pretty happy, everything looks like it is where it should be. The next port of call here is to get in and start thinking about removing the belts at the front so that we can get off the aircon compressor. We need to undo the tensioner, as you can see here. I think that's a 15mm socket, and we'll whip the belt off nice and easy. And this is the main serpentine belt. You can see there, it looks in great nick, nothing wrong with it. The aircon belt, also no cracks, in good condition. We'll pop them to the side, they'll be being reused for the stroker itself. So the next thing we're coming to here is the aircon pump itself. It's got 4 big bolts that hold it onto a massive housing that also holds its tensioner to the block. These are 13mm bolts, so we'll grab the windy gun out and we'll stick the 13mm socket in the end and we'll start buzzing them out. They're really long bolts, so I actually leave them, I think, inside the air compressor housing, and we'll pull them away. I don't want to pull them out. Drop them down to the side, and then we'll undo all these bolts on this side. Now at this point I didn't realise there's a couple of bolts holding on the housing from the front end round here, guys. So we're going to leave them in place right now and we'll get all the way around to the other side by spinning the engine over, and then we'll remove that later on. Last little bit on this side is the 10mm bolt that holds on the O2 sensor wiring, little cable tidy thing. That's actually quite important. You want to leave that on there because it allows you then to run the O2 sensor wiring, away from the exhaust manifolds, and it thus means that when you come to plug the O2 sensors in at the top, that everything makes sense. In other words, they both have the same length wire. The front O2 sensor wire goes to the rear plug as you look at it from the front of the engine on the top of the engine. The rear one goes to the front plug, and when you put it away in the cable tidy, it's pretty much impossible to get that wrong. Folks that don't do that end up confusing the two O2 sensors and you end up with problems. So let's swing the block round now and we'll have a little look on the other side. This is more complicated looking, this side, but the stuff tends to be easier to remove because it's not all heat treated. So first port of call we're going to go for here is going to be the hard or the steel water pipe. That's actually got a couple of 13mm bolts that brace it against the back of the block. And the O2, not the O2 sensor, sorry, the knock sensors. So that's one knock sensor there. And then there's another one here, and that's a twin wire with one plug that comes off the block, and we'll pop him down and keep him safe. And then the last bit here that we've got with the water pump is this looping pipe. Now this is not a standard pipe. This actually comes from a kit from a Subaru, believe it or not. It's just a silicone hose, and it loops the hard water pipe back to the head. And the reason I do that is because in the UK we don't see the kind of cold temperatures that are going to cause masses of grief with throttle body icing. When fuel passes through the throttle body, it cools it, and in cold environments that can freeze on the throttle body itself and it can cause you some problems. Most car manufacturers put some kind of coolant pipework into the throttle body to keep it nice and warm. That means when you remove the throttle body you've got to break open the cooling system. I don't have to do that because of this looping pipe. Easy fix, and something that I usually do in most of the cars that I work on because I don't need the throttle body warming. Okay, so the block here looks pretty naked. We're down now to the point where we're looking at having the Vanos oil line removed, the alternator, the oil pump housing, and the power steering pump. So I think the first thing I do here is I grab a 19mm socket and we remove the Vanos oil line from the oil filter housing. Always remember that you need to keep your 2 washers, so you need 2 new fresh copper crush washers. One on either side of the banjo fitting, guys. Okay, so out comes that banjo bolt. We've dropped the washer. Make sure we keep them together, and I'll pop this all on the bench. I actually screw the bolt back into the oil filter housing, so I just can't lose those washers. It makes it a lot easier come reassembly to find these things when we need them in desperate times and desperate measures. Right, so at this point we're looking at the alternator probably first and the oil filter housing. What I'm pointing at there and there is the leak pattern that you get normally from an oil filter leak. The gasket on the back of these tends to leak quite badly because it goes hard over time. I'll show you that in just a second. And the oil will show itself by coming down the back of the block and off of the sump. We've got 2 bolts to remove the alternator. It's fairly easy to get off. One long and one short bolt. Alternator just bolts on there. There's no pivot on this alternator. That's taken up by the belt tension is taken up by the tensioner itself, so we don't have to worry about any pivots or any tightening of bolts like that. These come out fairly easy. Now, That may or may not be the case with yours. If you notice, that alternator definitely looks a lot newer than the rest of this engine, and that's because it was changed before I got my ownership of the car. I think it's only a few years old, this alternator. So top bolt is out. That's the kind of brassy coloured bolt. It's actually zinc plated, and then the bottom bolt looks like it's nitride hardened. It's a different kind of bolt, and it's a little bit longer from memory, I think, but I'll show you that in just a second. Here I'm just pointing out knock sensors. That's where they go on the block, one in between cylinders 5 and 6 on the right there, and then the second one is bang in the middle of cylinder 3. They're basically just little microphones which listened for metallic pinging noises inside the cylinders at the specific point in the burn cycle. That allows the engine to identify if there's pre-ignition beginning to occur. They're very sensitive though, and that also means that with things like loose alternator bolts or with broken engine mounts, it can give a false reading and it can start retarding timing and changing things when it's actually not a problem. So there goes that alternator off. It's nice and clean, nothing wrong with it. We'll pop them down to the side. And then the next thing we have to tackle is this whopping great oil filter housing. Now, just before we get there, there's your two bolts. So your longer, blacker one on the bottom and your zinc plated one on the top. What I wasn't sure at this point is if I can remove this entire housing in one piece. I've never actually removed one of these before. So there's a tensioner there, there's a power steering pump at the bottom, and the oil filter housing at the top itself. It's held onto the block by 6 13mm bolts in 3 different sizes. So I think I actually give this a shot and I go in and we just undo the 6 bolts and hope for the best. Hopefully if we do that, the whole thing will come off in one big nice assembly and we can worry about taking it apart later on. So here come the 6 bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, and you can see there on the bench they are of varying lengths. The 2 in the middle I think are different lengths from the one at the top and the longest one. So off comes the housing. It's got a couple of dowel pins that hold it in place, and whopper, there is our lovely black gasket you can see there. That's that convoluted looking little black line that I'm pointing out right now. It's basically an O-ring, guys, so it goes flat over time and goes hard with the heat of the engine. Doesn't seal very well, oil leaks out the bottom of it, comes down the bottom of your block, and bad days ensue. So we're quite happy now. We've got most of the ancillaries off the engine. We're left with a few bits on the front, and we're left with a whopping great big crank pulley bolt. So I think we're getting to the point now where it's about time to attempt to undo this 410 Newton meter massive jobby. It's got a 22mm head, so what are we going to do? I'm going to pop back over here where I've left all my exhaust bolts, my gearbox bolts, and grab a couple of flywheel bolts and a handy crowbar. I'm going to pop a couple of flywheel bolts into the flywheel, and I'm going to jam the crowbar in there and let it rest against the engine stand whilst I try and undo the crank pulley bolt. And at this point then we'll then slide into that gap in between the 2 bolts, the crowbar, and grab a 22mm socket and the breaker bar and start having an attempt at removing this big bad boy. It is a monster, there's a lot of torque behind this, so the first thing I'm just going to try and get it all sized up, make sure I can definitely lock this bar and it's not going to slip too easily. Obviously this is not an ideal way of doing this. You might want to undo this when it's in the car with the flywheel holding pin. There's some general ideas that might not be the best thing to use, so it's up to you to make a decision on how you do this. The easiest way would be a really, really strong windy gun, which I don't have. This thing here is made of cheese and has got nowhere near the right amount of torque to be able to remove this bolt, so I give it a try. I thought I might as well. You never know, you might get lucky, but luck was not on my side with this bolt. There was no way that was going to remove the crank pulley bolt itself. We need an alternative plan here. I think my idea is sound with holding the flywheel at the back, but we need a lot more torque in there. So once again we get the breaker bar out with the 22mm socket on. Can I hold it myself and try and undo it? Let's give it a try. I don't know what I'm smoking. I need a helper. Natalie, come on over here and give us a hand. So what I'm doing here is to get Natalie to stand on the engine stand itself and just support that bar in the back of the engine, the crowbar, and I give it everything I've got with my breaker bar to try and undo it. As you can see there, I'm stretching and straining pretty bad, and again, and you got no chance, Sonny, so let's get the big breaker bar out. Apologies for any arachnid lovers here. I am an animal lover, but this thing lives in the back of the garage with a whomping spider living inside of it, and I'm afraid in this situation I wasn't prepared to let him come running into the garage and crawl up my back, so he had to go. Please don't hate me for that, guys, but yes, that gives us a massive 4-foot breaker bar. We've got a handy girlfriend standing on the engine stand, which I actually begin to lift up off the ground with this force, but we give it everything we've got. And bang! Oh no, that's never good when things do that. So why is it done bang? Well, first thing we've realised is it slipped off the flywheel bolts at the back. Okay, let's give it a bit more force again. Try and squeeze it. It starts to move here, so we're beginning to get something, but it feels a little bit like it's twisting. Anybody that's done hard bolts in cars before will know that when things really slowly release torque like this and don't, free up immediately, it's not normally a good sign. So we just check. Oh man, is the socket gone? Has the breaker bar failed? No, it looks alright. Is everything around okay around this side? Yeah, I think it is. So we keep going and it gets loose finally. So you need about 3/4 of a turn before it comes loose, and there is your big bolts. It's got very fine thread. It's a massive bolt with a massive washer in it. It's supposed to be a stretch bolt. It's supposed to be changed every time you change the engine. I don't think that's necessary, but what I do recommend is if you reuse it, then check its torque periodically after the engine's back together. It's not a left-handed thread, it's a regular thread, and the natural turning of the engine will want to undo it. So I now just attempt to remove the crank pulley. I'm forgetting at this point I've got a tensioner in the way from the Aircon pump, so the crank pulley will only come off a certain amount of the way, and sadly we've got to just get in there and remove that thing first. So I think there's a couple of 13mm bolts holding that tensioner on, so we just buzz them out with the air gun. It's good enough at least to do stuff like that, so it makes the process a little bit quicker. Off comes the tensioner and off comes the crank pulley. Sweet. We'll just lay him down to the side there. And then at this point we've got the two different bolts for the tensioner in my hand. We've then left with the Aircon bracket tray, which I can now undo these front bolts from the side of the block, and off he comes. And we're getting there now. So now we're left with really the thermostat housing, the water pump, the engine lifting bracket, and a couple of sensors. So at this point here I think I'm undoing the water pump itself. It needs a little bit of persuasion because this one was a fairly new water pump which was replaced, I think, when I got the car, if not then when I came back from Ireland and I had the overheat in Ireland. But he's a nice metal impeller water pump. We're going to pop him to the side and keep him because there's nothing wrong with him. The seal's nice, the impeller's still nice. And then the next point of call here I think is to remove my aluminium water pump, my aluminium thermostat housing. Because of that I'm going to be using a cooler thermostat. I believe that's something that's a fairly good idea to do. We're going to get in there. There's a 13mm bolt holding on the engine lifting bracket top and bottom, and a 10mm bolt holding the rest on, and I can't find my 10mm, so we're looking around here for it. Goddamn 10mm sockets, man, they are amazing at getting themselves lost in the garage. Yeah, I know, I should put things down where I last used them, but unfortunately it doesn't always work. So eventually I find it here underneath the crank pulley that I've just removed, and we can finally get to the point where I undo the thermostat housing. So few cranks and tweaks with the old bar, and thermostat housing should free itself up and come away. Actually at this point as well, what I'm removing here is the crank sensor. I've put into the crank sensor bolt a regular 10mm hex headed bolt, not the cap head bolt. I find cap head's a bit of a nightmare, so wherever I can I change them out for a regular 6-pointed socket. They have their purpose, if you've got the head of a 6-point socket and it's fouling something that you're trying to tighten, and they're no good. But in this situation, normal 6-pointed socket works absolutely fine. So crank sensor is then loose, but we need to remove all the thermostat housing to just pull it easily out the way. It comes out, but I'm going to be tearing it all apart anyway, so why try and make it harder for myself? So off comes the sensor wiring, and there you go, there's my aluminium housing. The gasket was replaced nice and early on, and then we're going to finish up today by pretty much getting to the point where we're left with a long block. So off comes the spark plug covers, two 10mm bolts. We'll lift them up with the 10mm nuts, we'll lift them up with the housing, and Bob is your uncle. So at this point in the day, I started this process at about 10 o'clock on the Monday morning, and we're now at around about 7 o'clock in the Monday evening. My aim was to try and strip the block down in one day once it was out the car, and I'm really pretty much on track, even though I've had a couple hours of delay. I've had a really good day, I'm happy. The process of making the stroker is long into its progress. We're going to get there. Here we go, guys. Thanks for watching. As always, pay me out, guys.